Hey, 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 AP World History students. I'm Miss Ziegler, the Time Machine teacher, and this is the amazing review, A Race to a 5, Week 7. So let's start at the very beginning of Period 1, the Paleolithic era. This is when fire was first found, and people are able to change their diets because now they can eat meat. Also during this time, there is lots of migration throughout the world, and during this time, people are also hunters and gatherers, where they go and look for their food, they hunt, they gather what they can, and they're nomadic. They follow the animals around for their food source. Then we get into the Neolithic period, when we have the Neolithic Revolution. This is where they switch from hunting and gathering to farming and settling down in one place, because you have to settle down in one place in order to grow your crops. So the Neolithic Revolution is important because this is when domesticated animals are first seen. We get what's called a food surplus. Out of that food surplus, now it doesn't take the whole community to farm, and so there are people freed up to do other things, such as government and writing and technology and all these other things that progress throughout time. Now people can do that. So think back to the very beginning of the year when we talked about Dr. Jared Diamond's theory, Germs, Guns, and Steel. That's what this is based on, because he says that the reason the Europeans were able to progress so much faster is because they had access to the right geography. Their geography spread from east to west, remember? So the climate was the same, the time of day stayed the same, and they were able to grow the same crops from east to west. Also, they had the same domesticated animals, and they had beasts of burden, which meant that they had animals to pull a plow and help them with the farming. Whereas in other countries, such as North and South America, the only domesticated animal that they would have had would have been the llama, and that was not a beast of burden, and so they weren't ever able to progress to that stage like the Europeans because they were focused more on farming. That's his theory in a nutshell, the Germs, Guns, and Steel theory. And if you're interested, you need to check out his History Channel video on this. It's really good. I put a link in the comments below. It describes it a little bit more in depth, and it'll be good for you to review because you might be able to use it in an essay. During these civilizations is where we will see governments and political organizations start to rise up, because there is a need for a government to organize and maintain access to resources and water. These governments will then need security, and so that's where military and police come in as organizations to provide security for the bureaucracy. Most of these governments are going to be male-led. It's very patriarchal. There are some exceptions to some female rulers in these early times, but for the most part, it's going to be male-led. Religion also plays a big part in these civilizations because people need a reason to know why they exist and to know why bad things are happening. For example, when a flood happens, it must be the gods that are angry. And that's kind of how that all starts. We see another form of government emerge during this time called a theocracy, where religion is a part of ruling that government. We'll see this in Mesopotamia and Egypt as well. The big difference between Mesopotamian and Egyptian theocracy is that in Mesopotamia, the rivers flooded very sporadically. So their gods were considered very unpredictable. However, in Egypt, the rivers flooded predictably, and so their gods were considered a little bit more predictable, a little bit more on the side of the humans. We also see different forms of spirituality in this time, where we had pantheism, which is the belief that God exists everywhere, polytheism, which means that there are many gods, and then eventually monotheism, which would just be one god. That brings me to the 4 major civilizations of this time period. The first one that you need to put down in your notes is Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is located on the Tigris and Euphrates River in the Fertile Crescent. We see the Sumerians and the Babylonians coming out of that civilization. The second is Egypt. That is located in the Nile River Valley, and Egypt is a super interesting one because of the pyramids and the tombs that have been found, and all the studies that Egyptologists have done throughout time. Egypt also has several female rulers, including my favorite, Cleopatra. She had quite the crazy life. So as I said, Egypt was formed around the Nile. One of your vocab words that you might remember from Egypt was the shadoof. Remember we talked about how that was an irrigation system that they used in order to irrigate their crops? Our third civilization is in the Indus River Valley in India. All right, our most famous cities within that civilization were Mohenjo-Daro. They have the very first indoor plumbing, which is kind of interesting. They also start to form the caste system in these early stages, which is their version of a class system. It's the only place in world history that has the caste system. Don't get it confused for just a class system. They're one and the same, but caste system is only in India. All right, so just remember that when you're writing your essays. Then we have the Chinese civilization, which is in the Yellow River Valley. China was interesting at this point in time too. Remember, they have the mandate of heaven, which means that the ruler is ruling based on if he keeps the gods happy. So when bad things happen, like flooding and starvation and drought and different things like that, they blame it on the emperor, and then the emperor would get kicked out and they would put a new emperor in. So if the emperor has the mandate of heaven or the favor of the gods, then he will have a longer rule. However, if he does not have the mandate of heaven, he will be kicked out. Also, during this time, we talked about the dynastic cycle. That was the cycle of how families ruled, things are going well, then they lose the mandate of heaven because things are going badly, and then a new dynasty takes over. That's the dynastic cycle. Politically, Egypt and Mesopotamia also differed. Egypt was very unified as a civilization. They were joined under a pharaoh, and they lasted a lot longer because of this. The pharaoh was also revered as a god. Egypt lasts for almost 3,000 years, and there are several pharaohs throughout the different time periods, some better than others, but most of the pharaohs were looked at as god figures. This will entice the people to follow them more as well. Eventually, the pharaoh's power will decline though, and people will have a little bit less respect for them. Politically, Sumeria was a lot different than Egypt as well, because they were broken up into city-states, and each city-state was ruled by a king. So that, along with the environmental devastation, will eventually lead to outside forces coming in and trying to conquer. One of the key concepts that you need to know are reasons why civilizations fail. So definitely economic devastation, outside forces coming in, and also political problems within the governments. Another thing to note about these two civilizations is that Mesopotamia and Egypt do interact with each other because of their close proximity with each other. Through this interaction, we will see an increase in technology in both of the civilizations, such as new kinds of weapons and musical instruments. So to summarize period 1, you need to make sure that you know that because of climate and environment, people are sometimes forced to migrate to find food or better farming areas. Make sure that you know the switch between hunting and gathering and Neolithic Revolution, which will cause people to be more sedentary in their lifestyles. Also during this time period, we see an increase in technology through metallurgy, which is the work of metal. So we will have more weapons and farming tools. We also see the invention of ways to irrigate crops, which leads to more surplus of food, which will eventually lead to people being able to invent writing and all sorts of other things to improve their civilizations, because they have more free time and they're not spending as much time farming. Out of this, we see labor systems formed where different class inequalities will begin to exist. Also, governments will be formed, as well as religion will be very important during this time. And last but not least, we see some trade going on between the civilizations that are close to each other. And that's period 1. Make sure you've taken notes on all this information. The second thing you need to do is look up the key terms. I provided those in the links below. Make sure you do some practice questions from this time period. And last but not least, you need to do that mind map. And I will put the link to that video in the description below, as well as suggesting it right up here. So make sure you head on over to that video and check out how to do mind maps. It's a pretty cool tool, and it will help you understand where all these places are. Tune in next week for 6 weeks before the AP exam. We're getting closer, and we will be covering period 2 during that time frame. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, if you have not subscribed yet, please make sure and subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss a thing.